This is the Jug O Sip podcast.
Okay, according to this, Frank Murphy was born, in Evidence for Family, Frank Murphy was born in 1935. Which that would make him
a silent, which would have meant
he would have got in on near the end of the silent generation.
So his parents probably would have been like
those were the greatest generation.
Now
his parents.
It's interesting that he's silent generation because that might bring on that silent desperation. That generation didn't feel like they were allowed to say what they wanted.
Well, yeah, that's the thing.
They wanted, but they weren't. They didn't feel like they were allowed.
And that's what's interesting because you make an interesting point bringing up his generation. One, silent generation kind of rounds to silent desperation, but
it kind of says it all, doesn't it?
The reason why they call the silent generation silent is because when the greatest generation lived in this country, they lived through things like the Great Depression. They had a harder. Their version of America was
suffered a lot.
Yeah, there was a lot of suffering. Their experience of America was just considerably harder.
Right.
And their children grew up with them, witnessing all of this and living with it. It was typical of people of the silent generation to want to be just like the greatest generation.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were very conformist in that way. And what ended up happening is that they knew that they were coming up on a world of abundance, or they imagined they did. So after seeing their parents suffering, it was the general consensus or common sense, I guess, of the silent generation to give their baby boomer children much more than they had.
Well, it's interesting because my nan and pap were silent.
Yeah.
And I would say to them sometimes, it'd be like, well, doesn't that bother you? Or doesn't? And they're like, well, we just learned to live with it. They got to a point. They just learned to accept whatever the fuck they had.
And that was kind of
because they grew up so poor. But they longed for more. So when they started giving their kids more, it created the entitlement of the boomers.
And that was the hallmark that defined the silent generation. They accepted they accepted what they had, but they longed for more. And they ended up giving all that they longed for to their children.
Which brings us to why Frank might have been abusive to Kevin more so than the other kids. Now, he's kind of abusive to the other kids. He coddles Maureen because she's the girl, which was also pretty common.
Right.
Kevin, the oldest child, he was the one I related to the most. He was the one kid that would tell you to fuck off and he was going to pursue his dreams no matter what. And Kevin got in trouble constantly for sneaking out to do things for his band and breaking the rules. I think Frank hated him not because he was acting up and not appreciating what he was giving him. I think he was fucking jealous.
Probably.
I think he was jealous of Kevin's boldness and his ability to say fuck it to the man, because Frank would have never been able to do that. Frank was a silent generation kid.
Right, but that's why
that relationship often happened. You'd always have that one kid that was a little rebellious and the parent that hated them.
But that's why I like how the show, it just keeps going back to observing different examples of silent desperation.
And every member of the family has it.
Because there's actually a scene in the show where it actually begins with a flashback of Frank coming back home from fighting in Korea. Uh-huh. And while in on this flashback, he was sitting in a convertible. He was sitting right outside of his future wife's house.
Smoking a cigarette, looking cool as fuck in his military uniform.
Talking to this kid about how this kid still has his freedoms because of all of the fighting that he just got back from doing. He felt and looked like someone that had the whole world ahead of him.
He felt like a hero.
And here's the thing: by those standards of where the country was at the time, he had the right to feel that way because that's where the country was.
Well, and that's again a very common thing from that generation. When you look at characters like Eric Foreman's father, Red.
Yes.
Even Al Bundy. What does Al Bundy always loop back to? His silent desperation.
Yeah.
He's always like, I was a football star. Yeah, like 30 years ago, Al. Well, but he can't let it go because that's all he fucking had. And that's why he's so resentful to his wife. And that's why Frank's resentful to Sue sometimes.
When that's the thing, the men of the silent generation, especially that era, they back there playing.
Yeah, the girls are playing.
If you hear any growling back there, that's our dog and cat playing.
It sounds far more vicious than it actually is.
Yeah. They're best friends.
They've been quiet all day.
Wow, and they pick now to play. Okay,
whatever. I'm just glad they're playing.
But basically, Frank. The thing is about the men of that generation. A lot of them experienced this need for the American dream, and when you thinking about what that means, a lot to a lot of people. Like for some people, if you're like you can find the Jug O Sip podcast on YouTube and Spotify every Monday and Friday.
And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and follow at Jug O Sip Podcast on all social media.